The breaking point came on a night when the snow fell soundlessly, thick as wool, smothering the cabin in silence so complete that even the fire dared not crackle. Anne sat awake, her body trembling, her hands clasped over the psalter that had grown worn and brittle with her constant touch. She had read the words until they blurred into nonsense, until prayer itself felt like an echo in an empty hall. Across the room, Margaret and Thomas lay still, but not with the deep slackness of sleep. Their faces were serene, their lips parted, moving faintly in time with the rhythm of that eternal murmur. It was as if the chapel itself had claimed their dreams, binding them to its cadence even as they slept. Jonathan sat by the door, unmoving, his back rigid, his head bowed. He did not look at her when she spoke, when she begged him to listen, when she reminded him of Albemarle, of their beginnings, of the children's laughter before the valley had taken them. His lips moved ceaselessly, forming the prayer in silence. Only once did he raise his eyes to her, and in them she saw no anger, no pity, but a hollow brightness, like embers glowing within a log long since burned hollow. It was then she knew he was gone, not in body, but in soul. Anne decided she could no longer wait. She gathered what food remained, a small loaf of bread, a strip of smoked venison, and a flask of water drawn from the stream before it turned foul. She wrapped them in a cloth and hid them beneath her shawl. Her plan was simple, desperate, to take Margaret and Thomas and flee into the mountains before dawn, to walk until her legs gave out, to put distance, any distance, between her children and that ruin on the hill. She told herself that survival was possible, that the mountains might yield shelter, that another settlement might be found. Yet in the secret chamber of her heart, she knew her flight would not take her beyond the prayer. Still, desperation is its own courage. When the hour came, she touched Margaret's shoulder, whispering her name. The girl's eyes opened slowly, her pupils wide and dark. For a moment, Anne thought she would rise, but Margaret only smiled faintly and said, "He is already waiting? Why do you resist?" Her small hand brushed Anne's cheek, and her skin was cold, not with the chill of winter, but with a deeper absence of warmth, as though life itself had ebbed. Anne recoiled, her heart hammering. She turned to Thomas, shaking him gently, but his eyes opened already knowing, his lips moving in that soundless hymn. He did not speak, but the look he gave her was one of sorrow, as though he grieved for her stubbornness. Anne rose in panic, clutching her bundle. If the children would not come, she would go alone, if only to test whether escape was possible. She unbarred the door with trembling hands, each creak of the wood sounding like thunder in the silence. Jonathan stirred but did not turn. His lips continued their movement, his body rigid as stone. Anne slipped into the night, pulling the door closed behind her, her breath clouding in the air. The snow was deep, the cold biting, but she pressed forward, her feet sinking with each step, her shawl clutched tight around her. She did not look back at the cabin, at the faint glow of fire through the window. She kept her gaze fixed on the line of trees, black and skeletal against the gray sky. If she could only reach them, she thought, perhaps she could vanish, hide, survive. But as she climbed the slope, the sound rose, not behind her, not within the cabin, but ahead, beneath the snow itself. The prayer pulsed up through the ground, muffled but unrelenting, as though the earth itself breathed it. She stumbled, fell to her knees, her hands sinking into the powder. The snow was not snow. It was ash, light and dry, staining her palms gray. She cried out, clutching her hands to her chest, but no sound left her throat. For in that moment, she realized the valley had no boundary. To flee was to remain within its grasp, for it was not the chapel alone that bore the prayer. It was the land entire. She staggered back, half mad with terror, and turned to see the chapel looming above her, its blackened walls stark against the snow. She had not chosen to climb toward it, yet here she stood at its threshold. The door hung open, though no wind moved it. A warmth drifted from within, not the warmth of fire, but of breath, humid and steady, as though something vast exhaled within its walls. She could not move. Her body shook, her limbs stiff, her breath shallow. Then from the darkness within, a sound reached her. Elias's voice, clear and bright, calling her name. She wept, for though she knew it was no longer her son, still her heart ached to answer. She stepped forward, her foot upon the threshold, her hand reaching for the stone, and there, in that instant, she realized she would never leave the valley. Not by road, not by river, not by death. For the prayer had bound her, as it had bound Jonathan, Margaret, and Thomas. She belonged to it now, as surely as the ash belonged to the fire that made it. Anne's foot lingered on the threshold, as though the earth itself sought to hold her back. The chapel's air pressed upon her chest, thick and acrid, carrying the faintest scent of charred wood, soot, and something older, deeper, almost like soil turned over in centuries past. Her hand hovered above the altar stone, trembling, and she felt the warmth rise through the soles of her feet, through her knees, seeping into her spine. It was not fire, though it burned as fiercely. It was the weight of countless voices, patient and ceaseless, pressing against her skin like the pressure of water against a diver too long submerged. Jonathan followed, his body strangely calm, his eyes reflecting a glow she did not recognize. He spoke no words, only gestured for her to join him. Margaret and Thomas knelt behind the altar, their faces serene, pale in the dim red light that emanated from the timbered walls. The children's lips moved silently, the cadence of the prayer carrying without sound, bending the air around them. Anne wanted to scream, to flee, yet each step toward the stone seemed inevitable, as though drawn by some force older than human will. The chapel's interior revealed itself fully to her gaze. The walls, though blackened and broken, bore the faintest traces of symbols, curves and lines she could not name, etched deep into the timber as if carved by a hand possessed of terrible patience. The floor was warped and scorched, yet upon it lay the faintest impressions of kneeling figures, countless and overlapping, their outlines pressed into the wood like shadows made solid. A faint heat rose from them, the memory of bodies long since, consumed, yet still present in some unearthly echo. Anne's hand finally fell upon the altar stone. It was rough, uneven, yet pulsing as though beneath it some heartbeat. The instant her fingers touched it, a shiver ran through her, and she heard it, the full chorus, layered and infinite, filling her skull with the rhythm of the prayer. Not one voice, not two, but hundreds, thousands, singing, murmuring, whispering. The words were not words, but sense made flesh. Covenant, binding, unbroken. She staggered, tears streaming, unable to draw breath, and felt the chapel's warmth climb through her body, spreading in waves that forced her knees to the floor. Jonathan knelt beside her. His hand brushed hers, and for a moment she felt a flicker of recognition in his touch, a memory of the man she had loved. Then she understood. It was too late. He, like the children, had surrendered fully, his mind and body consumed by the rhythm of the prayer. There was no part of him left to resist. Anne pressed her face to the altar stone, gasping, tasting ash and iron upon her tongue. The prayer entered her, not as sound but as weight, a pressing that settled into her bones, her marrow, her heartbeat. The glow of the chapel intensified. Shadows stretched long across the walls, coiling and twisting as though alive. Anne glimpsed shapes, thin and elongated, bending as though in perpetual reverence, moving in the corners of her vision. They were neither human nor wholly spectral, yet they belonged to the covenant. They were the brethren, the first witnesses of this place, and their patience had endured through centuries, waiting for those who would kneel and allow the prayer to consume them fully. She looked to the children. Thomas's lips moved in perfect cadence. Margaret's small hands pressed to the floor in silent rhythm. She knew now that Elias too was here, not as a boy, not as a brother, but as part of the chorus. His voice merged into the unbroken hymn of the chapel. The realization struck her like a blade. Those who had entered before her had not perished. They had been remade, woven into the prayer, bound beyond the reach of death or time. Anne's last thought before surrender was of Albemarle, of fields green and full of life, of laughter long silenced. She tried to grasp it, to hold it as a tether, but the prayer flowed over her, through her, and she fell to her knees. Her lips moved, forming sounds she did not know she could speak, her body obedient to a rhythm older than memory. The chapel exhaled. The glow dimmed to a steady ember light, as though breathing with those kneeling upon its floor. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows, silent as ever. And so Anne joined the chorus. Not with fear, not with defiance, but with the quiet acceptance of inevitability. The covenant had claimed her as it had claimed Jonathan, as it had claimed Margaret, Thomas, and Elias. The prayer, patient and eternal, now pulsed through 5 hearts, 5 bodies, 5 lives, all bound in one infinite rhythm. And in that stillness, in that terrible perfection, the chapel remained, waiting for the next to kneel, the next to surrender, the next to complete the hymn that had begun centuries ago. By January, the valley no longer felt like the world Anne had known. Snow lay heavy, but it did not whiten the land. Instead, it carried a grayness, as though ash had mingled with each flake. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though no hearths burned beyond their own. The stream, once quick and lively, had slowed to a sluggish trickle beneath its crust of ice, its waters thickened with a film that clung to the rocks like oil. Silence lay upon the valley, broken only by the prayer that seemed now to rise from the earth itself, a subterranean murmur like water flowing through unseen caverns. Anne could not say how many days passed, for time bent strangely. Morning and evening blurred. Jonathan no longer tended the fields or repaired the cabin. He stood for hours in the snow, bareheaded, watching the chapel. His lips moved ceaselessly, though no sound carried. Sometimes he raised his arms, palms, outward, as though receiving something descending from the sky. Anne dared not disturb him. She knew if she pulled him back, he would strike her down, not from cruelty, but from a faith that had consumed his mind and remade it into something unrecognizable. Thomas grew weaker, yet his eyes shone with a terrible light. He no longer cried or played. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were not his own. Once, when Anne tried to feed him broth, he whispered, "The chapel was not built for men. Men were brought to it. Men were borrowed." She dropped the bowl in terror, broth spilling across the floor, steam rising. She tried to shake him from his trance, but he only smiled faintly, as though he pitied her ignorance. Margaret's silence deepened. She wandered the cabin with bare feet, her nightdress trailing, her hair uncombed. She pressed her palms to the walls, listening, as though the timbers spoke. When Anne seized her by the shoulders, begging her to answer, Margaret whispered, "Do you not hear them? They are not praying for themselves. They are praying for us." Then she pulled free and knelt again by the hearth, her small body framed by the gray glow of embers. Anne alone clung to resistance. She prayed in secret, whispering words of scripture beneath her breath, though they felt frail as spider silk. She dreamed of escape, of gathering what remained of her strength, taking Thomas and Margaret and running north, never looking back. Yet always the same thought returned. The chapel would follow. It did not bind itself to the hill. It bound itself to them. One evening, as the last of the daylight bled from the sky, Anne ventured to the slope while Jonathan stood motionless at the edge. She crept to the chapel door, her breath rising in plumes. The air within was colder than the night itself, a dead cold that gnawed at her bones. The altar stone gleamed faintly, not with fire, but with a damp sheen, as though it wept. She bent closer and saw that the surface was inscribed. Lines and curves faint, blackened by the fire that had scarred the place. The markings were not letters she knew, nor even symbols that could be traced by reason. They were shapes that bent the eye, that seemed to change when stared at too long, that spoke not to the mind, but to some darker part beneath thought. She reeled back, clutching her chest, feeling her heart pound against her ribs as though it sought escape. When she stumbled from the ruin, she found Jonathan waiting. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but his mouth curved in a smile too serene to be human. "You see now," he murmured. "It is not curse. It is covenant." His voice was hoarse, almost tender, as though he pitied her resistance. She turned from him, clutching her cloak, and fled down the slope, her breath sharp in her throat. Yet even as she ran, the words burrowed into her, like hooks catching in flesh. Covenant. That night, she dreamed of Elias. He stood at the foot of her bed, his face pale, his eyes wide, his lips moving soundlessly. When she tried to rise, she found her body bound by unseen weight, her arms pinned, her chest pressed flat. She could not breathe. The prayer thundered in her skull, louder than any dream, louder than any waking. She woke gasping, clawing at her throat, and found Jonathan sitting beside her, watching, his eyes calm, his breath steady. He placed his hand upon hers and whispered, "You will not resist much longer. None of us will." And in her heart, she felt the truth of it. For even in her rebellion, even in her fear, the prayer had begun to shape her dreams, to twist her thoughts, to settle in her blood like seed waiting to root. The valley was not cursed. It was chosen. The winter dragged on, a season without measure, as though the valley had been cut loose from the calendar of the world. The sky itself seemed fixed, not the pale blue of January nor the thawing gray of February, but a perpetual dusk where the sun gave little heat and the moon hung bloated and yellow above the mountains. Anne ceased to mark the days, for each carried the same dread. The prayer was no longer a whisper. It was everywhere, woven into the wind, buried in the creak of the timbers, rising from the soil when her hands clawed through snow to find potatoes that were soft and black as rot. It was in this unmoored time that Anne learned the truth of the chapel. The knowledge came not from Jonathan, nor from neighbors, most of whom had vanished, but from the scraps of parchment Thomas brought one morning, clutched in his frost-bitten hands. He said nothing as he placed them in her lap, his face calm, his lips faintly smiling. The scraps were fragile, the ink smudged, the edges charred. She held them close to the fire, careful not to scorch them further, and pieced them together like fragments of bone. What emerged was not a prayer in any tongue she knew, but a history. In the year 1743, long before Jonathan had dreamed of farming, this valley, men from across the sea had come here, men not of the Anglican Church, nor of any creed she recognized. They were described only as the Brethren, and they sought solitude not for devotion, but for experiment. The parchment spoke of voices drawn from the earth, of words not carried by Scripture, but pressed into the soil long before men walked it. They built the chapel not to worship, but to contain, to amplify, to make the unseen speak more clearly. The records ended abruptly, but Anne felt the weight of what had been omitted. The chapel had not been destroyed by accident. The fire had been set by hands desperate to silence it. The congregation had not been lost to misfortune. They had been consumed. And yet, like embers buried in ash, The prayer had endured. When she confronted Jonathan with what she had read, he did not rage. He smiled a thin, weary smile and said, "Yes, they failed, but we shall not. We are stronger. We are chosen." His voice was hoarse, as though spoken through by another. She recoiled, but his eyes followed her with calm certainty. Margaret, too, seemed to know. She took to drawing in the soot upon the hearthstone, tracing the same shifting shapes Anne had seen carved into the altar. When Anne wiped them away, Margaret began again, patient as a scribe. "They are not wicked," she whispered once, her voice flat and distant. "They are waiting." When Anne struck her hands to stop her, Margaret did not cry, but only stared, with something colder than defiance, something like pity. The valley tightened its hold. No travelers passed. No birds called. The river froze solid, and beneath its glassy skin Anne thought she saw faces, pale and eyeless, drifting with the current. She dared not look long, for when she did, the water seemed to shift, and the faces turned as if to meet her gaze. Each night the dreams grew heavier. Elias appeared more often, his hair damp as though with melted snow, his mouth always moving though no sound escaped. But in one dream, the silence broke. He whispered clear and cold, "You will kneel." She woke with blood upon her tongue where she had bitten it, her pillow damp with tears she did not remember shedding. By now, Anne no longer wondered whether she could flee. The thought had left her. Even had she found the strength to run, she knew the chapel would not remain behind. It had sunk itself into them. Its prayer was no longer heard only with the ears. It had rooted in their marrow, in the hollow of their lungs, in the chambers of their hearts. And as she watched Jonathan standing in the snow, his face turned to the ruin, his lips moving ceaselessly, Anne realized with a cold clarity that she was the last among them who resisted. All others had already given themselves, whether by choice or by slow surrender. And she knew that soon, perhaps within days, she too would join them. For the prayer was patient, and patience is a weapon more terrible than fire. The loss of Elias hollowed the household like a flame scooping out the heart of a candle, leaving only a shell of light, trembling, soon to gutter. For a few days they moved as shades, speaking little, eating less, their eyes drawn always toward the black silhouette on the hill. Anne wept until her voice grew hoarse, and when her tears ceased they left her face stiff and empty, as though carved from wax. Jonathan carried himself as though he bore a weight across his shoulders, though whether it was grief, guilt, or something heavier no one could tell. Margaret clung to her mother, silent and pale. Only Thomas seemed unbroken, smiling with a brightness that chilled more than comforted. He said his brother was not gone, only changed, and that the chapel had kept him safe. At first they thought this was only the confusion of a child, a desperate attempt to shield himself from grief. But on the second night, as they huddled by the hearth, Thomas began to sing. It was not a tune any of them had taught him. The melody wound low and solemn, each phrase repeating, circling back upon itself like a rope tightening around the throat. His voice, though high and thin, carried an odd weight, as though another deeper voice hummed beneath it, unheard, yet felt in the chest. When Anne seized him, begging him to stop, he smiled faintly and whispered that Elias had taught him. Jonathan struck the table with his fist, but the blow silenced nothing. For hours afterward, the tune seemed to coil in the cabin's rafters, lingering like smoke long after the fire had died. The following morning, Jonathan climbed the hill again, driven by something he could not name. The chapel stood empty as before, its timbers black against the pale sky. Yet when he placed his hand upon the altar stone, he swore it was warm, as if blood had passed beneath its surface. He withdrew quickly, muttering the name of Christ, though The word felt brittle upon his tongue, hollowed of its strength. As he turned to leave, he thought he glimpsed a figure in the corner of his eye. A boy's outline, slight and still, standing just beyond the ruin's shadow. He dared not look full upon it, but in his heart he knew the shape, and the knowledge crushed him to the ground. He stumbled from the chapel like a drunkard, not daring to tell his wife what he had seen. The nights grew worse. Whispers rose louder, no longer muffled but distinct, though not in any tongue they recognized. It was a cadence without meaning, yet their bodies trembled at its sound, their breath falling in rhythm with its rise and fall. Margaret woke screaming that someone was kneeling at the foot of her bed, and when Anne rushed to her side, she found the girl's blanket damp, not with sweat, but with a fine sprinkling of ash. The air smelled acrid, as though the cabin itself smoldered, though no ember glowed in the hearth. Jonathan searched the rafters, the walls, the earth beneath the floorboards, but found nothing save the faint marks of char, as if wood long unburnt still bore the memory of fire. On the 10th night after Elias's vanishing, Thomas was discovered kneeling before the door, his forehead pressed to the dirt, his lips moving in silent prayer. When Jonathan seized him, the boy resisted with strength unnatural for his years. His eyes rolled white, his teeth clenched. Only when Anne cried his name did he soften, collapsing limp into her arms. When he woke, he remembered nothing, but murmured that the prayer must be finished, and asked for his brother. Anne clutched him to her breast and shook her head, but in her heart she feared that some part of Elias still lingered, not in flesh but in voice, weaving itself into the living through the lips of a child. By harvest, the valley had grown barren. Corn stood blackened and brittle, its husks rattling in every breeze like bones clicking together. The stream stank of sulfur, its fish floating belly up, their scales clouded. Even the air seemed thinner, heavy with soot, as though the hill exhaled its poison into every breath. Neighbors ceased their visits altogether, some moving away under cover of night. When Jonathan rode to the nearest tavern to trade, men turned their faces from him, muttering that he had brought the curse upon himself. He returned home empty-handed, the shame heavy in his chest. Yet even then he would not leave, bound not only by stubbornness, but by something darker, something that told him the chapel would never allow escape. On an October night when the moon lay hidden behind thick cloud, Anne woke to the sound of her name. Not spoken, not shouted, but breathed close to her ear. So near she felt the air shift across her cheek. She turned, expecting Jonathan, but he slept heavily beside her, his chest rising and falling in even rhythm. At the foot of the bed stood a figure, faint, ash-pale, its outline trembling in the dark. She saw the glimmer of eyes, wide and solemn, a child's eyes, familiar in their sorrow. She reached out before she could stop herself, her hand trembling in the dark. The figure leaned forward, lips moving, and though no sound reached her ears, she understood the words as surely as if they had been carved into her bones. Finish it. Then it was gone. Anne did not scream, nor did she wake her husband. She lay still, the words gnawing through her like worms through fruit. When at last dawn came, she rose to find Thomas humming that same tune again, soft, incomplete, waiting for her to join. She pressed her hands to her ears, but still she heard it, inside her skull, a prayer not yet finished, not yet bound. By November, the Winthrop household had ceased to resemble a family. They moved as though bound in separate dreams, each carrying a burden invisible to the others, each listening to voices that never ceased. Anne lingered in silence, her eyes hollow, her prayers faltering mid-breath as if the words no longer belonged to her. Jonathan labored from dawn until after dusk, though what work he performed no one could tell, for the fields lay barren and the tools lay rusting where he dropped them. Margaret scarcely left her bed, her lips moving ceaselessly, whispering fragments that made no sense, though Anne recognized in them the cadence of the chant. Thomas now hummed openly, without shame, as if the melody had become the marrow of his bones. The air itself pressed upon the cabin like a coffin lid. Each night the smell of ash thickened until Anne could taste it at the back of her throat. The wood of the rafters seemed to exhale faint wisps of smoke, though no fire burned. Dust fell from the ceiling not as dust, but as black flakes, fragile and brittle, as though the house itself were beginning to char from within. When she swept it away, the floorboards beneath bore faint gray stains that never lightened. The whispers, too, rose louder, swelling in her skull until she could almost distinguish words, though not in any tongue of Scripture. At times she thought she heard her own name carried in their midst, drawn out, broken, reshaped as though the voices toyed with it. Jonathan's mind turned strange. He spoke less, ate little, and stared often toward the hill. At times Anne found him kneeling in the yard, his hands clasped, though no prayer left his lips. When she shook him, his eyes widened as if waking from sleep, and he muttered that the land demanded reverence. Once, in a fit of trembling rage, he declared the chapel was no ruin at all, but a temple of great power, older than any creed of man. His voice quavered, and tears streaked the ash across his cheeks. Anne recoiled, frightened of the man she no longer knew. That night he did not return to their bed, but stood outside the cabin until dawn, staring unblinking toward the hill. The neighbors, what few remained, spoke now only in whispers when they spoke at all. One woman, gaunt with hunger, came in secret to Anne, pressing into her hand a small cross of willow wood. "Hold it against your children's mouths when they sleep," she urged, "lest the prayer slip out of them." Anne obeyed. But the next morning she found the cross blackened, brittle as coal, crumbling to dust between her fingers. She fell to her knees, clutching her chest, and for the first time since Elias's disappearance, she cursed God aloud. It was Margaret who first revealed what had been festering all along. One night, in a fevered whisper, she told her mother that Elias was not lost, but kneeling. "He knelt always," she said, "upon blackened boards, his lips cracked, his hands clasped, his eyes empty, yet unblinking. He did not weep, for he no longer knew sorrow, only the endless prayer." Anne seized her daughter and shook her, demanding who had told her such things, but Margaret only laughed, a sound thin and brittle. "He told me," she whispered. "He tells me every night." The horror reached its pitch with Thomas. On a night when the wind lay still and the stars were hidden, Anne woke to the sound of chanting. Not whispers, not half-heard cadences, but a full voice rising from her son's throat, strong and resonant, bearing a weight no child should bear. She rushed to him and found him kneeling before the hearth, his small hands clasped, his eyes closed. His lips moved in a rhythm older than language, syllables bending and breaking against one another like waves against rock. Jonathan stood behind him, not stopping him, not even watching, but murmuring in echo, his own voice raw and hoarse. Anne cried out, seizing the boy, shaking him, pleading with her husband to stop. But Thomas did not stir, and Jonathan only whispered, "It must be finished." His eyes gleamed with a light not his own, reflecting some glow that seemed to rise from beneath the floor itself. Anne thought she saw it then, the faintest shimmer, as though embers smoldered between the boards. Smoke curled upward, acrid and bitter, and in it she saw shapes, outlines of bent figures kneeling in endless rows, their mouths open, their voices rising in the say. The first sign, though it seemed small at the time, was the silence of the animals. The Winthrops had brought with them a pair of oxen, 2 hens, and a dog named Harlow, who had guarded their wagon faithfully across counties. Within days of settling, the dog grew restless, pacing at the edge of the fields. Hackles raised, his gaze fixed always toward the black frame of the chapel. He refused to climb the hill, though Elias tried more than once to coax him upward with scraps of salted pork. At night, when the crickets should have sung and the cicadas rasped their endless hymn, there came instead a curious hush, as though the fields themselves held their breath. Only the chapel seemed alive, its scorched frame catching the faintest sigh of wind, creaking like a ship's hull in the night. Anne noticed it most keenly. In Albemarle she had slept soundly, accustomed to the rattle of leaves and the low calls of night birds. Here the absence of such sounds pressed upon her ears like cloth muffling the world. It was not quiet, but smothered, as if something immense surrounded the valley, swallowing the voices of living things. She said nothing to her husband, who was too occupied with planting corn and setting fence posts. Yet in her eyes grew a weariness, a shadow of dread that deepened each evening as the sun dropped behind the chapel's broken tower. It was in the second week that Jonathan began to find his tools misplaced. At first it was small, his hoe leaned. Against the wrong wall of the shed, his plow left half-turned as though someone had tested its weight. He accused Elias of carelessness, and the boy, though puzzled, bore the rebuke. But when Jonathan discovered the axe buried not in the chopping block, but driven deep into the earth before the door of their cabin, as though marking the threshold, he said nothing. He pried it loose, wiped the soil from the blade, and hid it behind the hearth. That night he dreamed of a ring of men standing upon the hill, their faces blackened with soot, murmuring words he could not comprehend. The dreams multiplied. Elias began to talk in his sleep, his lips shaping sounds too muffled for sense, though Anne swore it was not English he spoke. Margaret, pale and fevered, refused to enter the fields at dawn, saying she had seen hands in the dirt, clawing upward, between the rows of corn. Jonathan beat the soil with his spade to prove it empty, but in doing so he uncovered a fragment of charred wood, black and brittle, yet still smelling of pitch. He cast it aside, though Elias later secreted it away, tucking it beneath his pillow, as if it were some talisman. The boy claimed it made the whispering softer. When his mother discovered it, she burned it in the fire. Elias wept until dawn, clutching his ears. The neighbors came less often, and when they did, their eyes flicked, always toward the chapel. One woman crossed herself upon seeing the children, muttering beneath her breath. Another left a basket of bread and did not step within the cabin door, pressing it instead upon Anne's hands before fleeing down the track. Jonathan grew angry, declaring the county full of superstitious fools who sought to keep fertile land to themselves. Yet even he faltered when he saw the oxen refuse to plow within a certain arc of the field, a line invisible yet undeniable, as if the beasts sensed where not to tread. The earth within that boundary yielded nothing, though the soil was as dark as the rest. When seed was cast, it withered within days, as though scorched from beneath. On the 17th night, the smoke returned. Jonathan woke to the smell, faint, acrid, not of fresh fire, but of something long burned and never extinguished. Rising from bed, he saw through the narrow window a dim glow upon the hill, as though embers stirred within the chapel walls. He stood transfixed, unable to rouse his limbs until Anne grasped his arm and whispered his name. When he turned to her, he found her eyes wide, her lips trembling. She had heard it too, the murmured cadence, low and many-voiced, drifting through the valley like a prayer spoken not aloud but beneath the earth. That same night, Thomas disappeared, for the space of an hour. Anne woke to find his pallet empty, the door ajar, the night air cold against her skin. Panic seized her throat as she ran barefoot into the yard, calling his name. It was Elias who spotted him at last, standing still upon the slope, no more than a dark figure against darker trees, his head tilted as though listening. When they reached him, the boy did not speak. He allowed himself to be carried back to bed without protest, but in the morning his feet were black with soot, though no ash lay anywhere upon the ground. The weeks that followed pressed upon the Winthrops like a slow fever, not burning but draining, leaving them hollow-eyed and short of breath. What had begun as whispers in the night became, by August, a constant undercurrent, a sound too faint to catch in words yet too present to dismiss. It was like the rustle of many mouths shaping a prayer not meant for human ears, carried upon every draft that slipped beneath the cabin's door. At first, Jonathan claimed it was the wind, though no trees swayed, no grass bent. Then he said, nothing, only worked harder. His shoulders stooped, his gaze drawn always toward the hill where the chapel sat like a burned offering left to rot. Elias grew restless. Once obedient, he now wandered from his chores, his face pale, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. He was found more than once upon the lower slope, his fingers tracing symbols into the soil. When asked what he did, he answered only that he was learning the prayer that binds. His voice held no defiance, only certainty, as though the words had been placed in his mouth by another hand. Anne wept and forbade him to speak of it, but that night Jonathan heard the boy whispering in his dreams, and though the sounds were muffled, they carried a cadence that chilled his marrow. Margaret withdrew into silence. She would sit for hours, with her doll, plaiting and unplaiting its hair, her gaze unfocused, her lips moving without sound. When Anne pressed her, she whispered that the doll was no longer hers, but had been given back by someone who stood at the edge of her bed. Each night, Jonathan grew harsh, demanding she stop such talk, but when he snatched the doll away in anger, he swore he felt the wood of its face warm, as though it had lain in fire. He hurled it into the hearth. The doll cracked with a sharp report, and, for an instant, the air in the cabin filled with the acrid stench of old smoke, not of pine or oak, but of something blackened long ago. Margaret did not cry. She only smiled faintly, as if released from a burden. Little Thomas grew bold where his siblings faltered. He spoke often of the men in the chapel, saying they called him by name. Anne forbade him from such tales, but the boy laughed, declaring that the men were kind, that they sang to him when the rest of the family slept. One morning he returned from the stream with a small object clutched in his fist, a scrap of parchment, charred at the edges, upon which faint lines of ink had bled and blurred. Though no words could be made clear, the parchment bore the unmistakable rhythm of verse, lines spaced like stanzas of a hymn. Anne tore it from him and cast it into the stove, but the boy screamed until his throat bled, his small hands clawing at the air as if something precious had been stolen. The land itself began to betray them. Crops that had sprouted strong in May withered under noonday sun, though rain fell plentiful. The corn stalks blackened at their tips, curling inward like fists. Potatoes unearthed from the soil bore strange marks, as if carved with fingernails. The hens ceased to lay, and one morning Jonathan found their dog Harlow stiff in the yard, his body unmarked, his eyes wide, his tongue swollen as though he had howled too long before dying. Jonathan buried the animal by the stream, but that night, the children swore they heard scratching at the door, followed by a low whimpering. Anne pleaded with her husband to move, to abandon the land, but Jonathan's pride held him fast. He had staked everything on this valley, and to leave was to confess defeat. "The land is sound," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It is only stories, only fear that makes it so." Yet even he grew wary of the chapel's silhouette. At dusk he would pause mid-stride, his eyes fixed upon its broken tower, and once Anne caught him mouthing words beneath his breath, though. When she asked, he claimed he prayed only for strength. By September, the dreams became unbearable. Each night the family seemed to share them. The sensation of kneeling upon splintered boards, of breath-filling lungs not their own, of voices layering, one upon another until language itself dissolved into pure sound. They woke gasping, the taste of ash upon their tongues. Anne clutched her children close, whispering the Lord's Prayer, though her voice trembled and faltered when she reached the words, "Deliver us from evil." For in her heart, she no longer knew whether they asked deliverance from something outside, the chapel, or from something it had already placed within them. It was then that Elias disappeared. One dawn he was gone from his pallet, no prints in the dirt, no sound of door or latch. They searched the fields, the stream, the woods, calling his name until their throats grew raw. At last, Jonathan climbed the slope, his legs trembling, and entered the chapel itself. Inside, beneath the open sky, the floorboards lay warped and blackened, the altar stone cracked but unyielding. Upon it rested a single object, a child's shoe, scorched at the heel. Jonathan carried it down in silence. Anne collapsed upon seeing it, her cries carrying through the valley until even the birds seemed to fall quiet. Elias did not return.
It begins with the smoke, though no one recalls the spark. On nights when the air hangs heavy over the valley, and the river moves like a sheet of dull metal beneath the moon, a faint odor of char and tallow seeps out from the abandoned hill, drifting into the homes of Amherst County as if the very earth were exhaling. Those who lived in the region in the early part of the century knew it well, though none would name it aloud. They said the smell carried not merely the memory of a fire, but of a prayer that had been spoken wrongly, a benediction inverted upon itself, whispered into wood that could not withstand the weight of its meaning. When the chapel stood whole, its timbers gray as driftwood, and its windows too narrow for honest light, the villagers climbed the hill every Sunday with a strange quiet upon them, the kind that lingers when one enters a room where someone has just died. The chapel was built in 1792, before the Revolution's dust had settled, by a sect that called themselves merely the Brethren. They left no proper records, though their names appear scattered in deeds, in inventories of property, in the half-legible ledgers of tobacco merchants along the James River. They were not Quakers, nor were they Baptists, and when pressed they answered only that they were keepers of the prayer that binds. What precisely this prayer was, no one can now say, for their hymnals have rotted to pulp, and the few pages recovered bear only faint ink smudges like mildew in the margins. But the people who came after remembered enough to fear it, and to keep their distance. For long after the Brethren vanished, the hill remained avoided. Though no law forbade it, cattle strayed from its slopes. Birds, it was said, did not roost in its blackened eaves. And on certain nights of smoke, of ash the chapel seemed to breathe. The year was 1821, when the last family brave, or foolish enough to settle, near the chapel staked their claim upon the lower ground, within sight of its silhouette against the tree line. They were Virginians of modest means, the Winthrops by name, whose fortunes had been bled by poor harvests in Albemarle, and who sought renewal on the fringes of Amherst County. Jonathan Winthrop was a man of 36, tall, stooped by years of field labor, with hands scarred by rope and blade. His wife, Anne, carried the weariness of 5 children, 2 of whom had already been laid beneath the soil, their graves marked by wooden crosses now tilting somewhere far behind them. The 3 surviving children, Elias, aged 11, Margaret, aged 9, and little Thomas, scarcely 5, clutched to their mother's skirts as the family wagon rattled along the rutted track and came to rest in the valley beneath the ash-colored hill. Their first nights were quiet enough. The soil proved rich, darker than they had hoped, and the stream gave clean water. Yet from the moment they arrived, the chapel presided over them like a judge above a courtroom. Its frame was scorched, its bell long fallen into the weeds, though the tower still thrust upward as if frozen in supplication. Windows without glass yawned black and vacant, permitting only the suggestion of light within, never its certainty. On overcast days, it appeared almost skeletal, the timbers like ribs, the tower like a neck craned upward in mute appeal, and remarked more than once that it resembled something that had not been built so much as grown out of the hillside, some bleak crop that should never have taken root. The neighbors few and scattered came seldom, and when they did, they spoke evasively of the hill. One man, an old veteran of Yorktown, spat into the dirt when Jonathan asked directly about the chapel. Another, a woman who traded butter for flax, said only, "Best let the dead pray their own prayers, sir." No one explained the matter further. But on the third Sunday of their residence, as Jonathan rose at dawn to mend the ox harness, he noticed smoke rising faintly from the chapel's roofless walls, though no fire burned. He stood long in the chill air, the scent prickling his nose, until Anne called him back inside. He did not tell her what he had seen that same night. Elias dreamed of voices, not of people speaking, but of voices themselves, as if disembodied, layered one upon the other in an endless susurrus. He woke with his hair damp, his hands clenched tight about the bed linen, and hushed him and said the move had unsettled him. But in the darkness, as the wind swept down from the hill and rattled the shutters, she, too, thought she heard a faint echo like many people kneeling upon creaking boards. Whispering all at once, she pressed her hand to her chest, told herself it was only the rustle of pines, and did not sleep again until dawn. Long before the Winthrops came to the valley, before the plow first broke its fertile soil, the chapel had already acquired the name by which locals half fearfully remembered it. The Ashen Chapel. Its foundation lay upon a slope where once the Monacan people were said to have held their burial rites, though no stones or relics remained to prove it. What endured was a sense of consecration that predated the arrival of the Brethren, and perhaps even drew them here. The Brethren, however, did not speak of native ground, nor of any inheritance but their own. They built the chapel with pine, cut green from the surrounding woods, its scent of sap filling the air for years afterward. And they painted its altar not in white or gold, but in a deep, unyielding black. Travelers who passed through Amherst in the last decade of the 18th century sometimes wrote of the Brethren in their journals. One described them as a grave company, eyes cast always downward, seldom smiling, seldom speaking, as if the weight of some covenant bore heavy upon their necks. Another remarked upon their peculiar services, in which no sermon was delivered, but only a long and murmured recitation, voices rising and falling together until the sound was like bees in a hive. No one outside the sect knew what words were spoken, for they never allowed visitors within. When questioned, they would answer merely that their prayer was not meant for curious ears, only for those who were bound to it. The Ashen Chapel burned in the year 1804. In the dead of winter, the fire came at night, and by dawn the building stood as it does still, charred timbers, blackened tower, a ruin rather than a house of worship. No one saw who set the blaze, nor did the Brethren remain to answer. When neighbors climbed the hill, they found no congregation left behind, no bodies, no possessions. It was as if the sect had dissolved into smoke along with the chapel itself. The only trace was a ring of ash around the altar stone, where the fire seemed to have lingered longest, as if reluctant to depart. Some said the Brethren had immolated themselves willingly. Others believed they had fled in shame after a failed experiment of faith, and a few whispered that the chapel had not burned at all, but had merely shed its skin, leaving the skeleton of itself to haunt the hill forevermore. What unsettled those who came after were the sounds. Though the building was deserted, villagers swore that on certain nights, the hill seemed to breathe with faint exhalations, as though many mouths whispered from within its ribs. A farmer's wife, gathering berries at dusk, heard what she believed to be the shuffle of bare feet along the chapel's floorboards. Though she saw nothing through the empty windows, children dared to climb the hill, reported that if they pressed their ears to the timbers, they felt a faint trembling, as if some vast voice rumbled far below the earth. None lingered long enough to test the truth. By the time the Winthrops arrived in 1821, the Ashen Chapel had stood derelict for 17 years, and the stories around it had hardened into a kind of local scripture, passed in low voices at firesides and in taverns. There was the tale of a miller who set his water wheel upon the stream at the chapel's base, only to find his grain spoiled within days, sprouting mold before it could be ground. There was the story of a boy who dared to steal a splinter from the chapel's doorframe, boasting of it as a charm, and was found weeks later by the riverbank, drowned though the water was scarcely waist deep. And there was the whispered recollection of a burial gone wrong, a coffin interred upon the slope below the hill, the ground collapsing in upon itself within a year, the body never recovered. It was said the land itself had been consecrated not once but twice, first by the ancient dead of the Monicans, then by the fervor of the brethren, who prayed in words no outsider ever heard. Such double consecration was no blessing, but a burden, a knot too tightly wound. To settle near it was to place oneself within the shadow of two faiths, neither of which could be reconciled with the other. Yet Jonathan Winthrop, weary of poor, soil and hungry mouths, heard only the call of opportunity. Where others saw blight, he saw fertile ground. Where others muttered of prayers best left forgotten, he thought only of his children's future. The warnings of neighbors fell upon him like rain upon rock. He listened, nodded, and returned to his plow. The children, however, were less steady. Elias would often pause at his chores and stare toward the chapel's tower, as though waiting for some signal. Margaret refused to walk near the hill, skirting wide whenever she fetched water. And Thomas, too young to know the meaning of dread, would sit in the dirt and sing nonsense rhymes that ended always with the same curious phrase. One nun of the family had taught him the prayer that binds